Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim Nossel. I'm the director of the Centre for International Defence Policy here at Queen's. And I have to say, it was a great pleasure when Greg McCallion told me that he was on a book tour of North America to talk about his book on human security and basically the comparison between Canada and Australia. And it was great to be able to invite him to the centre. Greg, as you know, is with the with Australian National University, the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU. And just so that full disclosure, I have seen this work in an earlier incarnation because I had the honour of being invited by the Australian National University to serve as Greg's external examiner on his doctoral thesis way back when. Some years ago. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Greg to Queen's and for him to talk about this book. So over to you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you very much to Queen's for all the great support that you've provided me, and very much a huge thank you to Kim as well. Hello, bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je suis très désolé, mais mon français c'est très mauvais, donc je parle anglais aujourd'hui. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Indigenous people, the Algonquin of this area, and to their elders past and present. I also have to do my full disclosure statement that the findings of this research and the opinions expressed are mine alone and do not represent the official position of the Australian government. Full disclosure, yes, I do work for the Australian Department of Defence, but I'm a visiting fellow at the Australian National University. So this research, as Kim was saying, stems from my PhD research when I was at the Australian National University. And the research really began back in 2010 when I went down to Canberra to the ANU there. And I was talking to another academic, a bit of a curmudgeon, who basically said to me, I was talking to him about my research. I said, I was interested in this concept of human security. And he gruffly looked at me and, human security is dead. Okay. That's a nice start for a PhD research. And look, he wasn't wrong, because from 1994, debates had really raged about this concept of human security. There was a big debate about its nebulous nature and the fact that it couldn't be defined properly as a concept. In fact, Roland Paris' seminal piece on human security argued that there's a limit to the usefulness of human security concept for students and practitioners of international politics because the concept lacks a precise definition. So critiques of human security argue that if we're making the security of each and every individual on the planet the object of our concern, the result of an approach is a complete paralysis of our ability to prioritise. So, but looking at that research of both proponents and critics, I noticed a number of two main things. The first is a shared assumption, and that assumption is that the core concept of human security really boils down to three major things. One, there's the prioritisation of the security of the individual. Two, protecting the individual from military and non-military threats. And three, mitigating those threats through the use of military and non-military means. But of course, the second shared assumption of both proponents and critics is they all agree that you definitely needed a definition, a clearly defined definition before it could be operationalised. But in 2010, at that stage, when I began my research, Australia had 1,550 soldiers in Uruzgan province, 1,500 soldiers as well as special forces personnel stationed in Uruzgan province in Afghanistan. In addition to their military operations, the Australians were conducting non-military activities such as constructing schools, medical centres and a waste management facility, all as part of the whole of government effort with Australian diplomatic, development officials, Australian Federal Police and corrections officers. At the same time in Kandahar, the Canadians were conducting military operations with 2,500 soldiers deployed. Like the Australians, the Canadian forces were engaged in both military operations and non-military tasks, such as rehabilitating a dam and irrigation system in the province, building schools and a local education system, and supporting a polio immunisation program, again as part of a whole of government effort. So when I started doing this research and human security was dead, I would ask my interviewees, the military, political, diplomatic, development assistants, all of them, I'd say whether or not is Australia and Canada doing a human security approach? And they'd say, no, not at all. But then if I asked them, is the security of individuals important? Oh, most important thing, yes, you really need to prioritise the security of individuals. Then I'd ask, is it just primarily military threats you're concerned about? Oh no, you've got to expand your concepts of what a threat is. And one brigadier mentioned that he became an expert in maternal health. Then I asked, okay, so should the military be providing the security in these other maternal health areas? Oh, absolutely not. No, it had to be a broader concept and non-military means to address these security concerns. So I'd ask them, are you doing a human security approach? I guess, now that you say that. So it was from that problem that, although human security was dead, according to the old academic, it seemed to be living on in some format. And that's what I wanted to investigate. And so that's what the research started off. So what I did was, I did a cross-comparative longitudinal case study in order to understand how the concept of human security has featured in and shaped Australian and Canadian military interventions. So the research utilised comparative case studies of two states, one that had declared human security in its foreign policy, Canada from the 1996 Chrétien government with Lloyd Axworthy, and to one that had not, which was Australia. These states were involved in two military interventions, one prior to the introduction of the concept in Somalia, and one following its establishment in Afghanistan. I conducted over 70 interviews with political figures, government officials, military commanders, ranging from prime ministers, defence ministers, foreign ministers, chief of defence forces, mission commanders, all the way down to development officials on the ground. I then used a human security framework of analysis. So what this does in terms of, for the more academic audience amongst us here, the framework utilises a norm acceptance literature to apply to the concept of human security. And I wanted to look at the way in which the concept was either rejected or accepted by states. So the framework really builds on the work of people like Amitav Acharya's norm internalisation process and Rice and Christie's work on human security. Sort of built and expanded these two frameworks to establish one that created a continuum of human security, of norm acceptance to norm rejection. So for human security, I looked at the way in which states had either rejected, co-opted, adapted, or adopted the concept. As I was saying before, I couldn't just go to people saying, did you accept human security? Because they were like, oh, we weren't doing it. So I sort of overlaid that by looking at the concept of traditional national security, whether it had completely transformed, evolved, assimilated, or continued. So by examining the question that way, the research was able to explain the puzzle as to why two states with differing declaratory policies would be implementing approaches that seemed like they were doing human security without actually having to use the term human security. So where I started was Somalia. It started in the early 90s with both Australian and Canadian forces. We're trying to create a secure environment. And I will say this, so whenever I mention Somalia in Australia, you sort of go, were we there? Say Somalia in Canada, and it's very well known for the complete failure of their ethics and the human security they conducted in that mission. But what my research was trying to do was not look at the leadership failure, the ethics failure, or the behavioural problems. I was trying to look at the concept. What was the concept of operations for the military commanders as they went into that environment? So when I was speaking to the Australian commanders, in particular then Lieutenant Colonel David Hurley, who was commander of the 1st Royal Australian Regiment, he made the statement that he felt he spent more of his time as a governor than as a military commander. In the sense that when he would go in, he'd create security to create a secure environment, he very quickly saw himself expanding into other areas of non-military tasks. When I put that to his counterpart, Colonel Serge Labbé, it's one that he wholeheartedly agreed with and then took through his concept of operations, which was very similar. So despite having a purely military mandate, here were two military forces undertaking both military and non-military activities with a focus on the security of the population. And this was before human security was even introduced as a concept. So while human security was not a stated objective in their mission, and it really was not, both Lieutenant Colonel Hurley and Colonel LeBay recognised three important factors. One, they recognised the limitation of national security approaches. You couldn't just shoot everyone. They were able to provide a level of cessation of violence, but that wasn't enough. Two, that human security approaches were a necessary, though insufficient, condition for success. They couldn't just throw out bags of rice and assume that that would create a secure environment. They still needed the military operations to be conducted alongside. And third, which is an interesting one in terms of these two case studies, was that human security had to be a reflection of their national values. We're Canadians, it's what we do. We're Australians, we're here to help, mate. It was the achievements of the Canadians in Somalia would obviously be overshadowed by the fundamental failure of human security, and that's something that we cannot ignore. But what I was looking at was not so, and this is probably the biggest weakness of the research, is that this research is really looking at the outputs and really not evaluating the outcomes. What I really wanted to know was, how do we get to this orthodoxy in thinking that this is the way in which you provide security, that the concept of what a secure environment entailed was something beyond that of a traditional national security approach. It was a messy bit in the middle there. But what we saw in Somalia was, despite the political justifications, which were very much about support to the UN, support to peacekeeping, the military commanders were sent there with a mandate to create a secure environment and very quickly recognised those three elements and expanded their constructs. So then if we fast forward into Afghanistan, both Australia and Canada had remarkably similar approaches to their declaratory policies and implementation approaches. So that's what the book really does. It breaks it between the political justifications and the military approaches. Australia's justifications in Afghanistan did not significantly change despite the 10-year evolution of the mission. Australia articulated three key justifications predicated on its national security: terrorism haven denial, support of alliances, and support to the Afghan government. And Canada, despite declaring a human security as a major policy in Canada's foreign affairs, did not utilise justifications for the Afghan mission that prioritised the security of the local population. The initial deployments to Afghanistan were all justified by the Canadian government in terms of commitments to NATO and the ongoing commitments to peacekeeping. Canada was only able to start articulating these human security justifications once the publication of the Manley Report had vindicated the implementation approaches and hence shaped the declaratory policies of the Canadian mission. Which sort of gets to one of my major findings of the paper, is that human security is a concept that works in practice and not in theory. It's something that works at the operational level and not at the geostrategic justification level. Because despite being junior partners in a coalition mission, both Australia and Canada developed significant innovations during their missions. For the Australians, one key one, and there's many others, but just quickly touch on, the establishment of the Trade Training School by the Australians was an initiative that garnered considerable interest. The Canadian introduction of the Strategic Advisory Teams, Afghanistan, the SAT-As, were also a significant development in non-military approach that were incorporated into the overall missions. I will pause here just to say that those two missions, and this is where I do examine this in the book, aren't completely benevolent human security approaches. There are fundamental elements with regards to the Trade Training School. How do you identify all the fighting age males in the area? Set up a trade training school. Doing strategic advisory teams, which are basically planning teams that go into the ministries of the Afghan government. How do you actually get intelligence about what the actual Afghan government, what's going on, what's happening, who's who in the zoo type thing? Well, obviously the SAT-As have a benefit. And that's where I started to look at the way in which human security concepts were co-opted by states as a means by which to lead towards their own national security interests. And that's very much where in the concept of counterinsurgency sits. But what the problem that the counterinsurgency model doesn't really fully explain is what happens when you start developing objectives that are beyond just the national security interests of the state. Well, it's no longer just a pure counterinsurgency model. It's something that's expanding beyond those justifications. So they're just two examples, and there's a number of others that are in the book, and I'll be able to go into more if you'd like to discuss that later. But what I will also say is, despite these elements of expanding into non-military activities, Over the course of their substantive deployments in Afghanistan, both Australia and Canada maintained significant traditional warfighting capabilities. While their approach to security was increasingly incorporating non-military approaches, traditional military means were still needed and were deployed. For the Australians, the deployment of the Special Operations Task Group throughout the different iterations of the mission was a necessary warfighting capability used to create a kinetic security effect for the provision of a secure environment. For the Canadians, the continuation of the JTF-2, the Joint Task Force 2 personnel, and the deployment of the Leopard tanks to the mission indicated there was a need for a significant warfighting capability, despite the increasing use of non-military means. However, despite the reliance on these military activities, they were recognised as necessary though insufficient. It's basically getting to that whack-a-mole approach to engaging with insurgents. And that's where this probably the biggest development of both Australia and Canada saw the increasing integration of civilian agencies into the military mission. The death of the Canadian diplomat Glenn Berry was a sobering event that emphasised the dangers that civilians were facing during the deployment to Afghanistan. But despite this setback, Canada continued to increase its civilian presence throughout the deployment through the use of what was then called CEDA, DFATE, RCMP and corrections officers. Australia also increased its civilian component through the deployment of its then called AusAid, the development arm of the Australian government, Australian Civilian Corps, deployable civilians, Foreign Affairs and Australian Federal Police and corrections officers. This is not to suggest that Canada and Australia radically altered their mix between military and civilians, their boots versus shoes ratio. For both countries, military expenditure, military personnel far outweigh the numbers of civilian contributions. Because, and this is one issue that I'm looking at, the civilian involvement in the missions was limited due to the issue of risk management. But what was most significant was the increase, what I call the deployability of civilians into these missions, civilian agencies into these military interventions, which is a metric leap from what happened in Somalia, where we said, we want to create a secure environment, send the military, they do that. It's getting to that recognition of you can't just send the military to create a secure environment, you need deployable civilians that are able to provide those non-military means to provide security. So once again, I argue that human security approaches were evident in the implementation phase. And once they were, that's when the government started to justify it in those terms. Following the Manley Report 2008, Afghan girls going to school became the justifications used by the Harper government. Similarly with the Gillard government, once the Australians had Gillard government mandated the debate within Parliament, justifications predicated on human security approaches were then utilised as justifications rather than as the initial deployments. So, but it brings me back to the three main things I've been arguing. That in Somalia, as in Somalia, both military, diplomatic and development officials all came to recognise the three major things. One, the limitation of national security approaches. Simply defeating insurgents on the battlefield wasn't enough, and that was demonstrated for the Canadians for Operation Medusa. That human security was a necessary though insufficient condition for mission success. That special operations and conventional military operations were also needed to protect those non-military activities. And three, that human security was a reflection of their national values. So for Australia and Canada share a strategic culture that values freedom, democracy and respect for human rights and the rule of law, thus enabling them to come to this orthodoxy in thinking about what defines security. So just to wrap up, I think this book has something for academics, I think it has something for policy officers and military commanders and political decision makers. For academics, struggling with nebulous concepts and norms and wanting to see an example of how it can manifest in practice, it proposes a theoretical framework that helps identify the degree of norm internalisation of states in a very practical way and a replicable way in other cases and examples. For military commanders, diplomats and development workers wanting to learn from previous experience and understand why we've moved towards a whole of government approach in the first place, I think it tells a very interesting story for that. It's for political decision makers as they see the big picture goals and start to understand what combination of military and non-military means will be most effective in the situations they face. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave you with one of my favourite quotes from the book, and it's from the now Governor General of Australia, General Hurley. when he was Chief of the Defence Force, I asked him about the future, I asked him about the next military intervention. And he said, well, I want to know by name who are the advisors who are going to be responsible for these different areas of the whole of government package that are going to come in with us. They may not be on that first plane as it's a bit too dangerous, but they need to be there in the first plane when it's not too dangerous to start establishing that link between security and development. For that insight and for many other fantastic voices within this book, I strongly recommend it because although human security was dead, I think long live human security. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Greg. Let's
Yeah.
throw it open.
I know it wasn't your topic, but this duty to protect that was evoked for,
Responsibility to protect?
which evoked for the attack on Libya and the overthrow of the Gaddafi government. It comes up periodically. It's not Canada or Australia that invoked, it's usually the USA or maybe Britain. But how does duty or responsibility to protect relate to human security?
So I'd probably say that the responsibility to protect is a top-down approach to looking at the declaratory policies of human security in terms of, it's probably was the next evolution in trying to look at geostrategic justifications for how is it that we avoid a Rwanda, because that was very much why the ICC, International Convention, tried to develop a construct of operationalizing human security, and R2P is the manifestation of that attempt at the geostrategic level. And it's obviously come in for a lot of criticisms in terms of its applicability and all those elements. And responsibility to protect is still up in the air, still up a question of, it's an application in Libya, the Russians used it for Georgia. It's a very nebulous concept and people have a lot of difficulty with it. I was looking at this from the other direction. I was looking at this at the operational sense. When people are set into a place to create a secure environment, what does security mean? And what I've found and what the research demonstrates is that when you are there, regardless of what the decision was for you to be there, when you are there and you are asked, create a secure environment, all right, I've got to stop everyone shooting each other. That's not enough. I've got to stop everyone shooting each other and I need mothers to be surviving childbirth. That's not just going to be enough. I can't just throw rice from the back of a truck and hope that everyone likes me. I'm still going to have to provide hard-edge security for people. So responsibility to protect, and as I quite say, human security is a concept that works in practice and not in theory. I'd still argue that it hasn't been sorted out in the geostrategic responsibility to protect area. It's still not a workable concept. So although I take a dig at Roland Paris, his point about, it's too nebulous a factor, I think he's both right and wrong. He's right. R2P has a long way to go, human security has a longer way to go in the geostrategic. But what I'm trying to demonstrate is, on the operational level, human security is something that people keep coming back to each time. Yes?
Yeah, so it's kind of similar to what you've been saying this whole time. I know you specifically mentioned the schools and infrastructure kind of built up in Afghanistan. I know there was a significant increase in rights for certain groups like women, but as a lot of Western forces started pulling out, those all started to go away. Is there a way to, do the forces need to stay in until a complete new regime is put in charge that has the ability to create policy to continue on this human security trend? Or was it worth it even for our forces to go into a country like Afghanistan where a lot is needed to really overhaul the system?
And look, no, it's a really good question because the sustainability element, right? How sustainable is everything we do? I guess what I'm trying to make the argument about here is that if you looked at Somalia, and if you looked at the way in which we just sent in some military commanders, two of whom didn't actually know what NGO stood for. They were like, you meant NCO, right? They know NGO. To the evolution of a civilian agency the integration of civilian agencies who are trying to create sustainable development objectives, rather than just counterinsurgency objectives. And the example is the bridge. Commander wants to build a bridge here for his freedom of movement for his soldiers. He knows that if he does that, the locals will really like him because they've got a new bridge because all the bridges have been blown up. Awesome. The humanitarian were like, yeah, build a bridge here right now because that's what we really need right now. The development official is going to go, well, actually, the long-term sustainability of that development, we actually need 2 bridges, 20 k's apart. If you build one here now, then what are we going to do in the future? It's trying to create those elements of sustainability. Now, is to say it's perfect and effective in the outcomes? No, I think we're a long way from that. But I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's the outputs, the fact that actually we need to start thinking about those things in terms of security, or else there's not going to be the sustainability. There's actually going to be upsetting what a secure environment means in the first place. So you're right. How many of those schools still exist? Probably not many. How effective was it? Probably not a whole bunch. But it's more the fact that at the, and I guess I use the example, if you're, the Irishman giving advice to people, giving directions and says, oh, I wouldn't start from here. You're like, well, that's great, but we're here. What do we do? Well, the recognition for everyone in that situation was the fact that this is what the only way that we can think of how to do it. If there's another way that we can think of creating a secure environment, happy to hear it. But to your point is, how long do they need to stay? I think that's one of the lessons of the book. It's going to be longer, it's going to be messier, it's going to be more expensive, and you're going to get mission creep. Because mission creep is basically what we talk about here in terms of, we're trying to create Switzerland in the Hindu Kush. Probably not a goal that's been reasonable. But it does have lessons for other, like Australia's going to be, and Australia's probably learnt more from this than Canada in terms of our involvement in Timor-Leste, Solomon Islands, and Solomon Islands is probably the high point evolution of that, to the point where it was police-led. It had a foreign affairs head of mission. Defence was there as the deterrent. They were flying helicopters non-stop as the deterrent. They had to keep maintaining those military operations just to create the deterrent effect to say, we will thump you if people step out of line here. So, and I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make here, is that human security hasn't revolutionised the world, and we're seeing a complete upturn of the apple cart in terms of identifying the security of individuals. But at the same time, we're also not seeing a continuation of military objectives. Because this is blunt, but if they wanted to, you could just kill everyone. We have the material capability to do that, but we're not. So it's some messy bit in the middle, and that's what the book takes you through co-option and adaptation, and sees where those elements go beyond just a counterinsurgency model to try and get the sustainable peace goals or security goals in the future. Yes?
Hello, I'm Brian Cox. I'm a visiting scholar at Queen's Law here, and also professor at Cornell Law and retired U.S. military legal advisor. I've provided that background to kind of give some explanations to the perspective that I always adopt. So it strikes me that the conceptual framework may have relationship to the interplay between human rights law and international humanitarian law, which is kind of obviously an unsettled concept. Kind of it seems to be the tactical and operational application of that kind of geostrategic debate. So is that an approach that you adopt at all?
No, it's not, and I look forward to further research and someone placing an overlay on that, because that would really be interesting. Because what I was trying to do, so in terms of a law aspect, I wasn't really looking at the ways in which the application of law was being conducted against that framework, but I guess one could be done. The point that I was trying to make a bit of a connection between the theory of security, like deep security theory, in terms of referent object and application of military means and so forth, versus the practice. So to answer your question simply, no. But I think there's space within this framework to place the theory of security with the practice of it, and then also looking at how human rights and things, because that's one of the main things in Somalia, for example, was rules of engagement. What were your rules of engagement? What enabled you to do it, and why didn't you do it? You had quite, and this is also talking to some Australians in Afghanistan, you had some quite expansive rules of engagement. Why didn't you conduct those? What limited you from doing so? It was like, well, we had longer term objectives. Yes, we had expansive fire objectives, but we limited ourselves because we understood that there was an interaction between our traditional military fighting and operations and our rules of engagement, humanitarian law, with our broader objectives. And I think that's what frustrated a lot of soldiers that and this is more anecdotally than in the book, was that inability to have that, let's go out and let's do this properly. And like, well, but for every person that you accidentally kill in the middle of that, you're going to create another 15 opposition people in response to that. So I guess we're trying to make that link, and I'd be interested if there was anything further on that. Yeah. Good question.
When I first saw the title of your talk, I thought this was going to be spending money on military versus spending money on climate mitigation. Because the big human insecurity now is climate. It's very much a cross-national border. And it seemed to me we're stuck in a tradition, certainly since the 7 Years' War in the 1700s, of nations choosing up teams, have a fight, see which side wins, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again, and then do it again. And it's sort of like a bad habit. Let's choose up teams of alliances and see who wins. But now we have this overriding global risk. So everything bad is on an exponential growth, right? Temperature, CO2, ice melts, permafrost melt, all of this is going worse faster. And if people, like if 10 million Australians die in a year, it's not going to be the Taliban that killed them. It's going to be the climate that kills them. And the same for Canada.
And I guess that fits in quite well with the concept of an expanded notion of what defines security. And this is the hard part that a lot of hardcore security theorists would say, oh, but if we include everything on the climate, then we're not going to do it. And securitization theorists would say the same thing. You're just securitizing the issue, and what value are you getting out of it? But no, I agree with that. I mean, Australia's probably got the closest example of that issue in terms of climate change, creating destabilization in our local region. Well, obviously, if you're going to send a military intervention into a country that has broken down in terms of its security predicated on a climate change issue, then you can go in there and stop all the people shooting each other. But if you're not addressing what is the actual factors that are driving that element, then again, that's what I'm saying is that, and what all the commanders found was, there is the military fighting, there is the insurgents fighting each other, there's a breakdown of security, there are people shooting each other. But that's not the issue. You have to look beyond what is causing the fighting to actually see that and that's what human security originally said was, we need to expand our concept of security beyond just that of people shooting each other. It needs to have a broader understanding. And of course, but how broad do we take that? And does that enable us to actually do something about it? And I think from a military intervention point of view, into the future, that's going to be an increasing concern. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Doug. That was super. One question, when you're talking about the human security, it seems that you look at it entirely fairly from the Australian and Canadian perspective. What about flipping that round? So how were the governance structures within Somalia and Afghanistan conceptualizing security from their perspective? How much did they include human security in that? And did they have the same idea of human security as the Australians and Canadians? Excellent question.
And I'm going to give you a terrible answer and say that I didn't look at that. But I guess what I saw and what I think has made a radical difference from the Somali point of view is you had a lieutenant colonel negotiating with the local tribespeople about what is it that actually needed to be done. Someone who is not trained in that. I guess, but moving forward, we then had development officials who then had local contacts who were able to then help develop the NDS, the National Development Strategy of Afghanistan, so that then we had a development plan which was national, which is then being locally implemented, which then development officials are then able to say to their military commanders, hey, here's the NDS, try not to blow up that entire area because these are the objectives that that the Afghan government and the local Afghan population would like to do. So in that sense, it was very much, I guess the big thing that was learnt from, and the Canadians had the good model of the for them, with them, by them. Right now there's complete breakdown of security. We'll provide that people stop shooting each other. But hopefully hopefully the local population in the formulation of a government will start doing stuff with them. And then hopefully it will be done by them. And that's where you saw the evolution for the missions from special operations, so the JTF2 and the PPCLI. Then you had the evolutions to the mixed missions, to then obviously the mentoring and training. And so Australia still has 450 trainers in Afghanistan working on that. Still have some federal police working in Kabul. And so there's quite a large mission there. So it's that transition to, what is it the local government needs and how do you enable the local government to do it and to take it into the future? Because Australia and Canada will go home. And that was always the saying, ISAF has the wristwatches, but the Afghans have the time. In terms of, they're going to be here. This is their country in which they need to be able to take responsibility for. But how is it that we enable them? Because the other biggest thing that I always disavowed people from, Australia and Canada and the US didn't do counterinsurgency in Afghanistan because they were doing second-degree counterinsurgency. The insurgents were rising against the Afghan government, and the Americans and the Canadians were helping the Afghan government counter that insurgency. So, and the commanders who recognised that, the commanders who understood that was the relationship with the local government that needed to be seen, that I think that's probably the better way to go. But again, I don't have the data to say that was correct. But a good example, David Hurley, when he first found first policeman that he could get, whacked a uniform on him, and made sure that the police were walking down the street, and 50 metres behind him was the soldiers. So it was that with them concept, to the point where that policeman could then go out and do their bit without the Australian soldiers. Sure, call for backup. But also, and I think for militaries, I think the big piece is about sustainability of the military concept of operations. Some of the early stages of the training that was taking place, of what is it that Afghan military needs, was it was predicated on airstrike, medevac, with helicopters, etc., which aren't going to be there in the future. So what's the concept of operations that the Afghan military could do with the resources that they have going forward? And I think that's what was more sustainable than here's a whole bunch of kit that you're not going to be able to sustain, maintain, and then operate with. So I will state that if you look at Somalia and you look at Afghanistan, we've come a long way, a really long way. And I think the big difference is, I use this glibly, but when humans started throwing rocks at each other, we didn't give up on it because we weren't very good. We eventually got to ICBMs. In terms of this whole of government approach, we're pretty much at the rock throwing stage. It's not very effective, but we've all come to the same output position because you need an expanded notion of security. So.
Where does human security and deterrence intermix at what point there?
Good question. Who from what, where, when, and how in terms of deterrence? I guess again, I'll use the Australian example because it's probably most effective in terms of deterrence. Particularly when you're thinking about what is the Australian capability to go into the local region to do another Ramsey, which is the Solomon Islands mission? Do you see local groups going, tell you what, let's start off an insurgency because we've only got to topple over the local Solomon Island group. Same with Bougainville, is probably the other one. So Bougainville's a small island in Papua New Guinea. The question of, do the insurgents actually want to kick off an insurgency knowing the Australians will have the capability not only come in militarily, but also come in with a full civilian suite? Is that going to deter them from creating destabilisation? So I think in terms of deterrence in that model, it's an internal deterrent function. But for Canada, you don't have a destable region unless you talk about your neighbours to the south. But I think from a geostrategic point, human security doesn't really fit within that kind of model, and certainly doesn't fit within a deterrence thing. But I guess the hard piece comes with that nuclear weapons, because that's actually where human security first came from. was trying to move the conversation away from nuclear deterrence and all these elements to a human security model, because people sort of saying we're spending at that stage hundreds of billions and even now billions on nuclear weapons and so forth. We should be worrying about what's actually affecting people's security. Gets back to your point before, what is actually affecting people's security, and it is not what we've traditionally focused on. So I guess, is that answering your question in some
It is,
break?
I just, I wonder where it is, if we look at local, is the deterrence, the purpose of that military to provide that deterrence, which then therefore leads to human security.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you absolutely need it. And I think, so a good example from the Canadians and the Australians actually is patrolling. The concept of visibly patrolling, even though it's a massive risk to your soldiers, having that visible presence out there to deter insurgents was absolutely 100% needed in terms of making sure that you have the insurgents know that you have that military capability and that you're prepared to use it. And I guess this is the point that I sort of counter people like, the Mary Colders of the world of the ultimate weapon is no weapon, will know that this research is arguing that you still need those military capabilities because you're still in fight. And Operation Medusa of the Canadians' experience is a really good example of, you can't send soft-skin vehicles into a proper head-on-head kinetic fight. You actually you do need those heavier capabilities and to not only survive the fight but also to deter the next one. Because that's the next thing, right? It's fine to fight one and survive it, but how is it that you deter the next one so you don't have to be fighting the next one? So yeah, I think the military operations are fundamental for that. Which is not a very popular thing to hear from the human security point.
Can I ask about the future? I noticed that in the book you've got the concluding section on the future. But I'm wondering whether or not the Australian and Canadian experience in Afghanistan, the Australians are still there, as you've noted. The Canadians got out early and they got out completely. We're not part of Operation Resolute Support. And what I'm wondering here is whether or not the experience of those 13 and a half years is going to have an impact on the future, and whether or not the lessons learned here are going to be the lessons about human security, or are the lessons learned going to be to stay away from this kind of mission?
I'm going to hope they're both, because after Somalia, Canada definitely said we're not doing that again. But the reality is, I think Canada's going to get sucked back in again into something. But I guess that becomes the question for Canada, what's your identity? Mali's the big one, the debate that's happening for you guys right now. But I guess the question comes, to answer the other side of your question though, will this deter political leaders from going into this thing? Possibly. I'd like to at least think that they, rather than seeing the military as an arm for which you can send off to another country to create a secure environment and just say, good luck boys, be home before Christmas type thing, that's not what I think political decision makers should be doing. So to get to your answer, yes, hopefully this book is saying these things are longer, messier, more expansive than you originally think, which will stop people from doing so. And I guess we've already got enough examples of that at the moment. We've got Libya trying to deliver human security from 35,000 feet, not very effective. But nobody wants to put troops on the ground. And I guess that's probably the biggest lesson from this is these are joint operations. These are, as opposed to those, the Navy off, Somali doing anti-piracy operations, you're not really going to be dragged into an expanded mission there in terms of engagement with a local population or security of the population. Same if you're only doing it from a bombing campaign like Kosovo or Libya. So to answer your question, yes to both. My biggest hope is that this book sits on the shelf for the next one, because and anecdotally again not in the book, but I asked, then Major General Crosland, what did he look for in terms of his training? And he went, I found a copy of Lawrence of Arabia's 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And I took that with me. Like, that was the training. So my hope is that, much like Somalia, we don't go, oh, that was long and expensive, we're not going to do that again. Throw the baby out with the bathwater, throw the concept of operations out, and then rock up to the next one and go, gee, what are we going to do here? And relearn those lessons. So I guess hopefully these are the lessons learned that are sitting there for our next concept of operations. Because the next thing is, we're going to have to, and I think this has been made, militaries have to be 70% ready for everything. High-end war fighting, peace enforcement, these counterinsurgency models, right down to HADA, humanitarian disaster relief. I just hope that we still remain 70% ready for that, rather than just, oh no, let's, and the drive is happening in Australia at the moment, it's great power competition is the next thing. The US has got the same thing, right? We're not doing Afghanistan or all that anymore. It's all about China, Russia, and so we need these. I'm just hoping that this book sort of helps add to that literature of, well, actually, in Somalia, you had the Somalia incident and you threw the concept of operations out, and it was exactly the same as the Australians. And the Australians picked up Somalia lessons and they took them straight to East Timor, because there's a number of senior officials, military members, and it was that institutional memory rather than a structural change. So just from my experience, I've seen structural change in the way in which the Australian military trains now. I think that's and I'd love to know more about the Canadians. Maybe that's a bit of a research project. But on all of our exercises, you will have, as part of the joint planning group, in the planning teams, you will have foreign affairs advisor, you'll have the defence policy advisor, you'll have the development advisor, as well as a humanitarian advisor. It's 4 advisors on a deployment of the Australian Defence Force in our regional training kind of exercises. So those elements where it becomes more of a structural practice as opposed to, hey Bill, did you go to that last one? Yeah, I did. What'd you do? Oh, we just made it up as we went along. Like, I'm hoping that this book can contribute a little bit to that. So, yeah.
Another question about history. How much does nation building figure in this? So there's a history or a mythologized history that Japan and Germany were thoroughly defeated militarily. And then in a decade of benevolent occupation, they turned into Switzerland. So we did it twice, so we can do it in Afghanistan, make them into Switzerland and Somalia. So how much does this memory of the nation building of defeated Japan and Germany make people think we can do this in other contexts?
Well, I guess the 2 of the largest economies in the world, but I've always said as well, if you're looking for long-term interventions, the US is still in Japan and still in Germany. Like, that's, we talk about 14 years. How many years has it been since, why are we still got US forces in Germany? People say, oh, well, no, it's, the fighting's, it was stabilization, but it's still regional stabilization. Because that's also the bigger picture of Afghanistan, was the regional stabilization across into the AFPAC border. So you're right. This takes longer, it's more expensive, takes more, but I guess the notion of nation building, it's one of the hardest things for the human security theorists in terms of they want to focus on the individual, right? But the one thing you can't get away from is the fact that in order to protect an individual, you need a state. Otherwise, you have the nasty, brutish and short Thomas Hobbes, everyone against everyone concept. So how is it that you build a state in order to protect the individual? So nation building has a really dirty word about it, but it's how do you build human security through the production of a state that is effectively focused on the security of the individual, rather than a puppet state that is primarily focused on the fighting. And I guess that's the expansion of security. Because my whole research, and if you're looking at my advice that I say to PhD students is, I was interested in, is the term security, the definition of it, expanding and changing? That was my big question. And then I tried to bite off just a little bit. Let's just look at operations and see if the operations have changed the concept of security. And in my opinion, and the point that I'm arguing, yes. particularly for those people who get sucked into those positions, that the concept of security is something more than just the cessation of violence. It's an expanded notion of security. I'm not sure that works geostrategically right now. I'm not sure that it works as an outcome, but everyone has come to the same output position, the same orthodoxy of thinking. So.
A question about Australia and Canada, the comparison. In Canada, as you mentioned, we had a foreign minister, Lloyd Axworthy, who was in office from 96 to 2000. And in the Canadian context, he was the champion of human security as an idea.
And a policy, yeah.
And as a policy, although, you know, as you mentioned, Mr. Axworthy had such a huge and expansive idea behind what it meant to be secure that in a Canadian context, frequently the criticism was made that you know, you simply weren't going to be able to provide that security, generally speaking. A question that I had when you were talking was there anyone in Australia who was a comparable champion? I mean, we had a coalition government under John Howard for much of the period that the Liberals were in power in Canada. The Liberal coalition, which is a sort of a conservative coalition in Australia. And I certainly don't have a sense that anyone in the Howard government was at all eager to press what I think was widely seen as a kind of a progressive idea like human security. So where in an Australian context was there a championing of human security as an idea underlying the intervention in Afghanistan?
Nowhere, and that's the interesting point. If anything, the fact that because in Somalia there was the Labor government at the time, Gareth Evans, who was the foreign minister, pushing forward a good international citizen construct at that stage, and that became almost party politics, which killed that concept. And that, you know, in order the coalition to separate themselves, they're like, oh, we don't do that kind of progressive. It's a progressive idea, and so. If anything, I find that the most interesting part, and again, anecdotally, and let's say this, not to leave the room, but it's already on this. One of the, in the setup of the ACMC, there was the Australian Civil Military Centre was a discussion about whether they call it the Australian Human Security Centre, and I was like, absolutely not, because that was seen as because there was a coalition government at the time, that was seen as a progressive policy, and I think that's where human security was really killed. It's a concept that doesn't work in theory, doesn't work in declaratory policy. But despite you have the Howard government trying to disassociate itself from the Labor government, you have, and Downer's, I spoke to Alexander Downer, the Australian Foreign Minister, and he talked about, no, his key priority was alliance management. His key priority was providing hard-edge military capabilities. His key priority was working with Brendan Nelson. I interviewed Brendan Nelson about it. I was like, what was your key elements about this? They're like, well, we wanted to provide the military part. We wanted to see supporting the military alliance. But then I asked them, well, how did you get down to this reconstruction construct? How did we get there? I was like, oh, well, that was sort of seen as, you know, advised up to us and the thing that we needed to do, as opposed to a top-down justification. This is what we're going to do. Despite the fact that there was a complete human security policy vacuum, the commanders on the ground felt enabled to say, I was sent here to create a secure environment. I've now got my policy guidance. I've now got my definition guidance, and I'll expand that to what I think is necessary in order to create that secure environment that you sent me here for. And I think that's a really interesting point about, despite what the political machinations about human security, oh no, that's not what we do, and that's a progressive lefty tree-hugging rubbish. You have a military commander going, maternal health is an important part of my mission. So that's something which I hope it crosses boundaries a bit, so it's not seen as a progressive issue. It's seen as human security is a concept that works in practice, something that is necessary. And I also make this point, look, you can drive the kids to school in a tank, but should you? And if anything, I hope that this book sort of demonstrates is that no, you should not have your brigadier generals in a maternal hospital working things out. What you should have in terms of your engagement with the civilian population is keeping your military and they are our application of lethal force in the international system. We need them to be able to be well trained in that element. The expanded notion of security, at no stage am I suggesting that the military needs to be involved in that. If anything, you need to focus them back on that capability, understanding that it needs to interact well with the other whole of government, because people say whole of government, like $1 for every meeting I've been in, where we need a whole of government approach. I'm like, I'm going to kill you all. What does it actually mean, and what are the practices? Because there's a separation in our military and our civilian agencies for very, very good reasons. But it's how do you work together structurally and in habits of cooperation that actually mean that you're going in the same direction. Some might even call it a strategy, but we don't use that word too much. So.
Are there any other questions? Then it is my great pleasure to thank you and for this particular presentation and a little token from the centre. So thank you very much.
Thank you all.
And I hope the rest of your tour goes well.
I do have a couple of books here if you would like to purchase one here, but unfortunately I can only accept cash. So 45 Canadian if you do have the cash, but yes, there's only a couple here. I'm working on getting it here in Canada available, but otherwise the Melbourne University Press website, which I think is going for $50 at the moment, so, but bargain.
Thank you very much.
Cool, excellent.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, appreciate it.